Thank you very much for the introduction. So good morning to everyone over there in Singapore. This is an unusual experience. I noticed I was reading in the paper just this week that Australia and Singapore are looking to establish some sort of a path between the two countries, a COVID-safe pathway. So it'd be nice to be interacting with you in person, but we'll make that another time. So as per the introduction, I'm going to talk to you about how Dr. Seuss can help with the skill acquisition programs that you're responsible for within your sports. And I'm presuming that you might have come across a Dr. Seuss book, and if so, that will certainly I'll bring that to life at some stage through the presentation if you haven't. To start with, so if I go to my first slide, next slide. Thank you. There we go. So I just thought I'd share a great story that I love talking about. This person you're looking at, his name was Dr. Jim Embry, and back around 1991, so quite a few years ago, he set a Guinness World Record for most consecutive free throws in a row without a miss. And if I had you live, we'd have a little survey around how many throws. So if you just think in your head, I wonder how many shots in a row you could put up without a miss. Well, Dr. Embry held the record of 2,750 in a row without a mistake. And the funny part of the story is that the only reason he stopped at 2,750, he didn't have a mistake, but he only had the basketball court booked for 12 hours, and they told him he had to get off the court. So quite an amazing story. These days, I think the record is something like 5,200 shots in a row without a mistake. So an amazing amount of skill for, obviously, in this case, a relatively close skill. But I think it tells you what the human body is capable of doing if you devote practice to it. So if we go to my next slide, the definition of skill for me is one that it does involve having good technique, sound technique, but it's also as much around how adaptable that technique is, and then how you can apply technique and adaptability when under pressure. So to me, that's the definition of skill. If you've got skill or if you think you're skilled, but all you're doing is exhibiting good technique, that's not the same as the way I'm thinking about it. You've got to have technique plus be able to adapt it under pressure. You need all elements to be representative of skill. Next slide. On the next slide, what you'll see is that hopefully you've seen this movie, The Legend of Bagger Vance. It's a terrific movie if you haven't. And he talks about that inside all of us we have a true, authentic swing that we're born with. So if we think about whatever sport we're involved with, you'll probably experience young athletes coming to you that have a particular way of hitting the ball, catching, moving, whatever it might be. And then sadly, it seems over time the world can rob us of that swing. It can get buried inside all the wouldas and couldas and shouldas, and you forget what your original swing was like. And I think this is one of our challenges when coaching youth. We really need, as coaches, to recognise what is this particular individual bringing to the sport that might be unique to them. And while it mightn't look like it's straight from a textbook, it's efficient, it's adaptable, it holds under pressure, in which case, as a coach, we shouldn't be interfering with that particular skill. Clearly, if there's a technical issue, we do need to make some changes because it might cause injury or the like. So there are reasons why you would intervene as a coach. But I think having a very good look at the talent and not rushing in to make intervention and change is a very safe strategy to start with. So if we go to the next slide, sadly what we see in sports such as golf, and if you go to the next transition, is I think we can focus on overcoaching, and it leads to what we're all familiar with of paralysis by analysis. So particularly when you're dealing with youth athletes coming through your pathways, it's very important to simplify the messages that you're giving your athletes, focus on doing one thing well at a time, and then progressing the skill. And we'll talk a lot about that throughout the session today. Next slide. The other key point, and you've just listened to Professor Mellett speak, and being an expert on the psychology of skill, we know that skill, or an error that comes from a movement, a skilled movement, can come from a number of sources. So it can be psychology, it can be strength and conditioning, or it actually might be the technical or perceptual decision-making qualities of the athlete. So in all cases, we really need to, as coaches, really think through what's the source of the movement error that we're looking at, and be very clear on what that source is before we develop an intervention. So instead of just focusing on trying to make a technical change, it might be more about working with them on some psychological skills, or it might be a perceptual issue rather than a technical issue. So I think, again, clarity here is very important. So they're really my introductory remarks just around what skill really is. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see this is the focus of today's presentation, is really to take you through a simple framework called the SPORT framework, which consists of these 5 key elements. And I think as coaches, if we can apply these 5 key elements, we're in very good shape to systematically develop our youth athletes in a very logical way, allowing for their individuality, but also progressing them at an appropriate rate. And so the SPORT acronym here, it's been used for a long time in the strength and conditioning field as an example. And so essentially what myself and my colleague Sam Robinson did was just try and apply the same acronym and look at it from a skill learning perspective. And so I'm just going to, over the course of the presentation, take you through each of these steps, providing examples along the way. So if we go to the next slide. So specificity is the first key area, the S in sport. And as the term suggests, it's really about how closely does whatever practice you're prescribing for your athletes, how closely does it actually represent the performance context. And it doesn't necessarily, this does not necessarily mean that you have to recreate the exact performance context in every facet. So you don't have to ultimately just play the game to get specificity, but it's about representing aspects that are aligning to how the game will be played. That's the key point there. So quite often, inexperienced coaches will see something like this and just think they have to play a full game all the time, and that's clearly not the intent. So what I thought I'd do is just show a few examples of how we've tackled this issue in various sports. So on the next slide, I'm showing you the training environments that our Olympic diving team practice in. So you'll see the top picture is what we call our dry land training area. So it looks a lot like a gymnastics facility. There's a foam pit, tramps, etc., where the athletes can practice their somersaults and rotational dives and then land in the foam pit. And then obviously down the bottom you have the pool environment. Now the key difference between the two environments is pretty obvious, but one of the most important things that changes between the dry land and the water environment is that in the dry land the athlete must land with their feet first into the foam pit. You can't land head first into the foam as you want to do in the water. When we complete biomechanical analyses of these two environments, so the same athlete doing the same skill in dry land and the aquatic or water environment, we see that diving into a foam pit, while it looks similar, there's a whole lot of biomechanical differences that start to emerge. So the jump height's less,
they actually step across the board with a reduced step length, and they don't depress the board as hard. They don't really summate as much force. So if we're doing a significant amount of volume in this dry land environment, while we think we're getting good transfer, specificity is telling us that we're not getting as much transfer as possible, and that there are biomechanical differences which are occurring, which is what's trying to be represented in those angle plots that you're looking at. So we have to be very diligent in the amount of dry land practice we're doing relative to being in the water. That's the key point there. If I take you through another example, one of the most common ways, and one more advance there. One of the most common ways in which we compare practice and match play is to literally chart the obvious characteristics of the two settings. So if you just transition one more, thank you. You'll see here we can compare, we pick variables of interest and we compare the frequency of behaviour in practice versus a match play setting, and then we give it a rating of specificity. So this is a really easy practical thing that you could be doing in your own coaching environment. So the example here that we're seeing, that this tennis coaching program, on a number of basic principles, practice does not at all look like the game. So a returner facing the server only occurred on 20% of the occasions, for example. The distribution of serves to the body was much higher in practice than it was in match play. The players didn't swap sides after each serve or second serve. They kept serving from the same side of the court for a block of trials. So these are all really simple little things that are in the control of the coach and player that can increase the specificity of the actual training environment. Some further work we did in tennis, if go to the next slide, further illustrates this. So we also see in practice relative to match play that the ball is hit faster with more spin, contacts made further behind the baseline, and fewer winners are struck. So what a common conclusion that we found when we visualized how much specificity was happening between the two environments was that in practice, the competition between the two players was more cooperative. So they were trying to help one another rather than compete and defeat one another. And that leads to some different qualities in the way that we prepare, which ultimately is probably making the practice a little bit ineffective and not as valuable as it could be for the amount of balls being struck during a practice session. Okay, next slide. I think a fundamental area of specificity where we tend to oversimplify is in the area of decision making. So no matter what sport you look at, you can see lots of these session plan ideas that involve essentially choreographed movement patterns. So here you've got a classic three-man weave type soccer dribbling task. But why is the player weaving and dodging if there's no opponent there to have to weave and dodge? So from a specificity point, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Further, if we look at the next slide, other common examples we see, dribbling around flashing lights. So last I noticed, in soccer, you don't play against flashing lights. You play against real opposition. Down the bottom picture there, dribbling around cones. So from a specificity point of view, I think a really simple change here would simply be to get rid of the cones, get rid of the lights, and put some form of defender in that you have to dribble and pass around. Now that, obviously dealing with youth, you're going to have a range of skill levels. So it might be that it's eight attackers and one defender to make the challenge appropriate. Or it might be a one-on-one if you're dealing with really high-skilled players. So as a coach, you can control the difficulty, but at least from a specificity point of view, you're actually controlling the environment to get some sort of transfer from the practice that you're prescribing. So I think it's a really simple thing that we can all do, is think about specificity, see what you can change accordingly. Next slide. I really like this particular study. It was done by a Dutch group some time ago, and it looked at the Dutch police force. And they had a group of police officers that trained by shooting at the targets on the top, and then they had another group who trained their shooting by having to come up against what do you call them? I've had a mental blank here. Coming up against thieves or robbers who they're simulating having to arrest. And what they found was that when you measure the shooting accuracy of these two groups who have practiced in very different environments, the shooting accuracy of the police officer you can see on the bottom was much more accurate than the group up on the top who just shot at stationary targets. So again, you can simply explain this by specificity. So hopefully I've mounted a pretty strong argument that whenever you look at your practice, you really need to be adhering to the concept of specificity. Okay, we'll move to the next letter of our acronym, P for progression. What we're talking about here is the observable improvement in the skill that you see in your athletes as they develop over time. And what this improvement allows, it allows you to actually load their challenge even further. So they have greater capacity and can tolerate increased skill practice. So very similar to an athlete, as they get stronger, you can add more weights. You can make them run faster for longer. And the same applies to skills. If they're showing significant improvement in a skill, you know you can load up the challenge of that skill. So my example earlier, 8v1 keepings off passing drill in soccer. Well, progression might mean we go to 8v8 or 4v4, whatever it might be. That's what I'm talking about here. So the interesting thing with progression, if we look at the next slide, if you look at a textbook, you're often shown a figure like this, which says early in practice there's a significant rise in the actual performance of the skill by the athlete, and then it sort of plateaus and it gets quite flat, and there's only very gradual improvement for the amount of practice that the athlete does. Now, this is a learning curve, but I think we all know, if you're involved in coaching of youth, you know that it doesn't look a whole lot like this at all. So if you just progress my slide, this is a more typical learning curve. There's lots of peaks and troughs. One practice session, the athlete's showing you fantastic amount of skill in whatever it is that you're working on, and then the very next session they seem to have regressed in that same skill, and then they make another little shift. So this is a very typical learning pattern, and as coaches we have to be very aware that progression isn't linear and that it will be a bumpy path, and that we don't need to over intervene. It's natural to have these variations in performance. So I think this is a key point about progression, allowing it to happen, particularly when you're dealing with youth who are going through growth spurts and the like. So their capacity to assemble a movement pattern is probably challenged every week, purely growth that their body is experiencing. You don't need to make it any harder for them by asking them to continually adapt or something about their skill as a consequence of this. So I think this is a really important point. But if we are seeing an athlete that is progressing in a positive direction and showing that they should be able to have some sort of capacity to increase a greater load, well, then there's some strategies that we have available to us. So if we go to the next slide, the way that we need to determine that is to firstly work out what the athlete's optimal challenge point is. And this can be different for each athlete, or even within a squad of athletes. There might be a few points here, and this is one of the challenges of team sport coaching, is trying to fit 20 different players' needs into the one team set. Here, basically, what we're seeing is that the learning benefit is at its greatest in some sort of inverted U fashion, as you can see the red lines. And then what you'll notice from a training point of view, we're not expecting perfection. We don't want 100% success, but we don't want complete failure. We want this happy medium. And so often you'll have seen, hopefully you might have seen that this is referred to as the Goldilocks effect. So we don't want the porridge too hot. We don't want the porridge too cold. We want it just right. And the same with skill learning. We need to find what that right challenge point is. So if I continue with my example from earlier, it might be 8 attackers and 1 defender to play a keepings off dribbling game. That might be the appropriate challenge point for your group. Or it might be 8 on 8, or it might be 8 on 4. You'll be able to determine that by the relative success that the group are having on that particular skill. So this is it's a very simple way to look at it, but very effective if you can think and have a number of variations to every activity or skill drill that you're performing with your athletes. Next slide. So there's been some research on these type of concepts before, and they come up with all sorts of fancy names like you're seeing here. Performance-based adaptive schedules to enhance learning. I think we can simplify it far more than that though. So if you just progress my slide. Really what we're talking about in terms of optimizing a challenge point is developing games like Around the World, which is you've probably all hopefully experienced at some stage, where a basketball shooting game where you start at one point on the key. If you shoot the ball in, you move to the next spot on the key. If you shoot it in, you move to the next spot on the key, and so on, to try and get around the world first. If you make an error and don't get the ball in, you have to stay at the point you're at. Or you might even, depending on the local rules, they might make you go back a spot. So that's called Around the World. Or another way that the scientific literature calls it is if you win or you're successful, you shift, and if you lose or are unsuccessful, you stay. This is a great practical way to optimize the challenge point for every athlete. If the athlete's shooting very well, they'll constantly keep progressing and shooting from different positions on the court. If they're not going well, they'll have a block of repetition at the point where they're at that fail point. And I think that's a nice way to make it simple for yourself when you're dealing with large numbers in a team practice setting, and you still want to optimize the challenge or the progression. Next slide. So I've just got a little visual illustration of these challenge points. So in this case, obviously the challenge is rather difficult for William Tell. And then if we go to the next slide, we can then create something that's a little bit too easy. Certainly would appeal to me, this particular one, and my golf putting skills, but that's obviously too easy. So very much the Goldilocks effect here. We've had not too hot. This is probably a bit too cold or a bit too easy. We need to find what's just right, which is the next slide. And just right is having a look at computer game play. And the way computer games are developed is a terrific way to instill the challenge point. So the developers had a basic catch cry of games should be easy to learn and difficult to master. And if you think of your favourite game, there's just multiple levels. You progress through a level, you get a bit of motivation through that progression, and you go to the next level. You defeat the next level, you go again. Or if you're struggling, you stay at that level till you master it. So they're very addictive, really well designed, and are based on this whole principle of having multiple challenge points, but keeping you at your level of challenge. So if you can apply the same logic to the way you sequence your skill learning, you're going to do very well. Next slide. Here's just as a summary, here's just one way to look at the progressions that you have within at your disposal. So at the left side of the figure, you can start with a video preview where there's no movement at all. Then you might go to a walkthrough. Then you got no opposition. Then you can have passive opposition. Then you can lead to active opposition and then to match play. Now, clearly, the transfer, so linking back to specificity here, is greatest when you're practicing more up the right side figure. But from a practice progression point of view, there's clearly some value in moving up and down this based on the needs of you. And I'm sure you can think of other could link into this progression chain. But I think it's just a nice way to conceptualize it and think it through. Next slide. All right, so we're up to the O for overload. And when we're talking about skill learning and overload, we're actually talking about the amount of mental work that the athlete is having to engage in when performing the movement skills. And like all skills and physical skills as well, it's advantageous to continue to overload to progress the skill learning. So I've just talked about progression. How do we overload? That's the key point that we're going to talk about in this particular section. What are some of those strategies? So we've got a challenge point. Now how do we overload them just a little bit above their challenge to see if they can stretch and get to that next point within their development? So next slide. The greatest tool you have at your disposal for overload is how variable you create the practice conditions to be. And so there's a mantra within the skill acquisition literature which says we want repetition without repetition. So we want to keep practicing something, but we want to find different ways to practice the same thing. And the more repetition without repetition, that actually creates load for the athlete. And so I think we all know it. So if I go back to my data that I presented on the serving practice early in the specificity section, what we see is that quite often athletes or coaches tell players to practice serving from the same side of the court for a large number of trials in a row. Now that's repetition, and there might be some variability in the type of serves you hit, but very easily, just by simply having to serve on the juice court and then the ad court and then back to the juice court, we're actually increasing a load through increasing the variability of what the athlete's experiencing. So this is really easy for you to manipulate within your particular sport. I'll give you some examples. So next slide. So the first way is through the way you organize the practice in terms of within the skill. So simply the figure here, it's a little hard to see, but essentially by adding a defender in this jump shot practice, we see that the switching between having a defender and then not having a defender, what it does, it creates variability in the way the shooter shoots the ball. Their angle of release changes by about 10 degrees. So this slide talks to specificity, but it also talks to the concept of we can make subtle changes within the same skill to increase the load. So to use a tennis serving example, like I was a moment ago, having to hit a slice serve and then having to hit a flat serve, that's what we would call within task switching. And just the simple direction to your player to switch the type of skill variation you want will lead to an increase in the load that they experience. And your job as coaches is to observe how quickly they can make that switch and perform the skill effectively. The quicker they make the switch, that's obviously a cue to you to continue to increase the complexity of what they're experiencing. But if they struggle making these switches, you know that you've already got a challenge point that's at an optimum level for your athlete. Next slide. And then the other key way to increase load is not only manipulating the variations within a task, but switching between tasks. So the example here, the basketball player is doing a shooting practice, and then goes and does some dribbling practice. And then goes back and maybe does some more shooting and then back to dribbling. So now the athlete's having to practice multiple different skills with different movement patterns required. That challenges the nervous system, and that challenge is how learning is generated, but it's equally how it also leads to an increase in load. So this can be quite demanding. So this between task switching, you might have also heard the term random practice, and that's another way to describe what we're looking at here. And the more random the practice is, the more switches between totally different skills, the greater the load, and if the athlete can handle that, the greater the learning as a consequence. Next slide. So related to that, errors that are made actually increase the mental load on the athlete. So if you've set your practice at a very difficult level and you're noticing that there's more and more errors occurring, well, that clearly is going to increase the load on the athlete without you doing anything else to the practice setting that you're working in. So you need to be very careful whether that's what you want. It might be on occasions, but equally too much task error is also not optimal. And obviously that's where there are a range of other practice strategies. If we were to look at the implicit learning literature, we talk about errorless practice, where you make very little errors, which actually has the opposite effect of reducing the amount of cognitive load that the athlete's experiencing. And again, that's a really useful strategy depending on the context and the athlete's needs at the time. Next slide. A really interesting part of load that we've more recently been focused on, and this was with our Australian Taekwondo team. And what we found was that the comment down below, it says anxiety in competition, boredom in training. So when we interviewed the athletes, they reported how they got bored in training, and it was because that they weren't experiencing any anxiety. They were literally, it was like going through the motions. They didn't have those competitive juices flowing. They were very familiar with the opponents that they were coming up against as training partners. And so finding ways to create this arousal and anxiety is a really important overload strategy. So whether that's through some sort of competitive scoring that you might introduce into a game, there's a whole host of different ways you might try and do it. But the key point is we do want to create some anxiety and arousal within the training load, and that'll have two effects. It's obviously good from a specificity point of view, but it's also really good from a increase in overload on the athlete. Next slide. And so I really enjoy this, and this is where I start to bring my presentation back to the opening slide of what can we learn from Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss, as a writer of children's literature, was really attuned to this particular topic of we learn from our mistakes, but we're motivated by success. And there's really a reciprocal link between these two concepts. So the more you learn, typically the more motivated you get to want to learn more. You get excited about how much progress you're seeing and you want to learn more. But then equally, we also know that you've got to make some error to actually learn from your mistakes too. And so this is where this challenge point concept is still really relevant. And I think Dr. Seuss knew that better than anyone when it came to children's literature. So next slide. So there he is. That's Dr. Seuss, if you didn't know what he looked like. And there's his book, and one of many that he wrote. But this particular book, his editor challenged him to write the book with only 50 words. So the whole book is written with 50 words. And if you go to the next slide, the way the book was written was within phrases. So I do not like green eggs and ham. Would you like them here or there? I would not like them here or there. I do not like green eggs and ham. So that's just a little extract from the book. And what you can see is that the phrases repeat with subtle variation. And so from if we're wanting to apply this into sport, quite easily you could replace the phrases with different skill types. And so I've just used the example of basketball. So you could have a jump shot representing the first phrase, and then a drive and dunk representing the second phrase. And you can see the way the practice would be distributed as a consequence. So it's a great example of repetition without repetition. So you're getting opportunities to repeat what you've just learned, but you're also being challenged to switch task or work between a task. So the amount of load can be managed, but it is a progressive overload, which is what we're really interested in doing. So I think at worst, if you're struggling for a way of sequencing the skills in a session, find yourself a Dr. Seuss book and replace phrases with skills, and you won't go too far wrong at all. Next slide. Okay, we're up to the R, reversibility. And this is simply the whole notion that I'm sure all coaches are really familiar with, that terrible feeling you get where you think, gee, have we done enough practice on that particular skill? So any sport that I've ever worked in, one of the most common concerns of a coach is that there's not enough time to get everything done. And so particular skills or strategies don't get practiced as often as the coach would like because there's just no time. And then this is the concern, reversibility, that we actually lose some of our training benefits because we haven't practiced the skill enough. So how does that work? Let's have a look at that. So next slide. So this is what it might look like. So imagine this is a passing drill in any sport that you care to visualize. And we're looking at, on the y-axis, you can see the number of passes practiced in a given week or given session. And then you can track that across a number of weeks, or they could be sessions. And then you can also represent the level of skill execution through the red figure that you can see there. And what we see is that there was obviously a progressive increase in the amount of practice. Then it gradually got reduced down to a very low amount, and then to no practice at all in week 5 before an increase later on. But what we also see is that the passing success, while it peaked, it then started to drop away. So implying that we weren't doing enough practice on this particular skill, and so we had an occasion of reversibility occurring here. So what are some of the issues or rules around this concept? Next slide. Well, the first key point is that essentially whatever your sport is, you need to be measuring the key skills. So depending on your sport, you might be using sports code or some other software program to code some of your key skills, and you need to be able to understand and measure the skill performance if you're going to understand whether reversibility is occurring or not. Now at a youth level, if you don't have this technology, you can still do it through simple skill tests or the like that you might do as part of a practice session. But you just need some sort of record of, well, how good are our players at performing our key skills. Next slide. In some sports now, we see that there's sensors inbuilt into, in this case, a tennis racket has a little chip in it, connects to your phone, and you can get a fantastic outcome in terms of some of the key qualities of number of successful hits or the amount of speed or spin, whatever it might be. And then that allows you as a coach to track. You can go to the next slide, thanks. You can actually track the volume, and you can obviously track the accuracy. So the figure here is one from Australian rules football, looking at the frequency of different distance kicks that were completed through a pre-season phase. And what's notable, and it's probably difficult to see in this, so I'll just talk it through, but essentially there was a significant reduction in the 40-metre kicks in late December, early January. And then what we see in the right-hand panel, the yellow line drops from 75% down to 70%, showing that there's been some reversibility in our long kicking efficiency because we had essentially a 2-week period where we didn't really practice that skill. So only through having these measured will we be able to identify this as a trend within the group, and then obviously reinstate some more practice on this particular skill. So that's where the measurement is critical. Next slide. So the obvious question is, how much repetition do we need? And unfortunately, there is no straight answer here. So if you get a straight answer from someone, I would suggest that they're making it up, because clearly the skill level of the athlete, the way in which skills are practiced, all have a bearing on how much repetition. If you've got a highly variable practice environment, you'll probably find that you need less repetition than if you do something in a very constant, blocked type of practice environment, where you probably do more repetition to get to the same level of skill. So it's a really difficult one where I would back your expertise as coaches to determine whether you need more or less, and obviously the measurement of the skill. Next slide. A bit of a mantra though is that the first practice repetition should be as challenging as the last repetition. So you always want the athlete having to be in that challenge point area, not having too many hits that are too easy and not having too many hits that are too difficult for them. Find their sweet spot and make it challenging for them. Next slide. Okay, so we're up to T. We're getting near the end, and then we'll have some questions. So tedium, which hopefully is not what you're experiencing, but I understand if you are, these online sessions can be like that. Tedium is obviously about monotony within the training program, and the way to offset it is by some of the things we've just talked about, which is increasing practice variability or variety. And then the other way, if we go to the next slide, is through the concept of athlete engagement. So we don't want the athletes to feel like they're cows being milked. We want them involved in the actual training process. We want them having to make decisions. So you need, as coaches, to allow for them to trial and error different practice solutions, solve problems, for you to ask questions rather than tell them the answer. This simple level of engagement will break the whole concept of monotony. So I think that's the really key point here. Next slide. And so if you haven't read anything about the concept of self-regulation, I'd encourage you to just do a little search on that. And this whole process of developing self-regulated learners is a really excellent way of developing engagement and then therefore decreasing monotony within the training environment. Next slide. So an example from swimming, we did a little practice observation study where we monitored our swimmers and their turns, and we had a little coding system that you can see here, and we're looking to see how many turns were done with good technique and skill through practice. And so we use this coding tool. If you go to the next slide, this was a breakdown. So the green represented the number of turns in a training session that were done really well. So we had 3 key technical points, and so out of 3, how many were done well? And you can see for these 4 particular athletes, they weren't done very well at all, and there's a lot of red there, meaning one or more of the key components of those 3 key components weren't done well. So and if you start thinking about swimming, in a given training session, you might amass hundreds of actual turns. So there's 100 odd turns where we've wasted the opportunity to practice effectively, basically because of monotony or tedium. So we need to find ways to engage our swimmers. So next slide. There's a terrific research paper that's worth reading called the Mundaneity of Excellence. And it was an observational study where Daniel Chamblay observed the US Olympic swimming team for an Olympic cycle. And one of his key findings was that excellence is achieved through qualitative differentiation, not quantitative increases in activity. So it wasn't about doing more and more turns. It was about doing less turns, but doing them well, is the way I certainly interpreted this work. So if we go to the next slide. Some of the one of the swimmers in the pool was Mary T. Marr, who was regarded as one of the greatest swimmers of all time. And as a 13-year-old, she changed 2 habits that you can see there. So she began to turn up to training on time. That's good. But then she completed every turn as specifically as possible. So she started to regulate her own behaviour. She started to pay attention to doing things well. And so she made this qualitative shift in her practice. She didn't necessarily do more practice. She just made it a higher quality. So these small wins, I think, are really what we're talking about if we want to overcome tedium. Next slide. We had a 1500 metre swimmer of ours, Mack Horton, and he's, I suppose, most famously won the 400 Olympics, 400 metre freestyle at the Olympics just gone. And so with Mack, when he was training for the 1500, again, lots of turns, and just through a simple touch pad that we put in the pool, we're able to give him feedback about his contact time on the wall. And so therefore he's getting more feedback, and he's not able to just keep cycling around, not engaging in the turns. He's getting key feedback to know whether he's within a preset bandwidth of making appropriate contact on the wall. And we did this for an extended training period within his program, and we got some terrific results in his turn behaviour as a consequence. So if you go to the next slide, this sort of just charts that. If you look at the circled area, you can see that his turn time, reading from bottom up, went from 8.23 to 8 to 7.65. So not much else over a period where he went from World Juniors through to Olympic Games. So he went from an elite youth through to an Olympian. The key thing that changed wasn't his swimming times, it was his turns. And we attribute that in part certainly to the work that he did in terms of breaking that monotony, focusing on quality with his turns, and got the result accordingly. So just a good example there. So just to conclude, next slide. I think if you're dealing with youth, you've got a license to create some fun and to create ways that you can develop variability and challenge. So again, this is a picture from a Dr. Seuss book, and it's about creating a whole new sport. So what are the ways in which you can find different ways to package up your sport to engage your athletes a little bit more, and you might actually find a new tactical solution or way of executing a skill as a consequence. So I think that's really, really critical. And then the final slide is just some of the predictions that we make based on this sport model of periodization. So the more specificity that you have, the greater the load will be on your athletes, but also the less amount of tedium. So in other words, specificity is a very good thing. Hopefully that's really clear. Progression is all about the challenge point. I've talked a lot about that today. And then clearly overload can be physical, mental, tactical, it can be any number of things. I think what we underestimate is the mental load. We don't really capture that very well within our practice. So when we underappreciate how much mental effort goes into performing skills, and therefore how that is an overload in itself. And then the bottom point there, increasing progression and variability, that actually helps increase your resistance to reversibility. So the point I made there was simply the more variable you practice, it's likely that you won't have to practice the skill as much because you get better learning quality, better stickability. So I think that's a key point. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you and open it up for any questions. There's some resources for those that are interested. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you, Prof. Farrow, for that really great presentation. Now we're going to go into the Q&A, and we're going to take a look at some questions that you have. First up, we have one question. Should coaches make challenge points easier the closer the athlete gets to competition to improve confidence?
That's a terrific question, and I think the answer is, well, there's two answers here. I think yes, you should, to increase confidence. But equally, depending on how well you know your athlete, there'll be some athletes who, if they're on top of their game, they might actually even get more confidence from you presenting them with a greater challenge, because it's almost like an over-training, over-learning strategy that they feel even more bulletproof if they get through a really demanding practice session close to competition. So depending on your athlete's psychological needs, I think comes into that.
Thanks. One more question coming in. When trying to balance training specificity with maximizing training volume, what factors would you consider when planning training?
Yeah, another excellent question. I think there's a lot to learn from the literature on small-sided games. So if we're thinking about team sports, quite often specificity means you might commit a large number of players to an activity or a drill, and not everyone gets a lot of involvements or skill touches as a consequence. So in each sport, the numbers will be different, but how can you reduce the game to still capture the essential element that you want to capture, but maybe you can do it with 8 players rather than 15 or whatever it might be. And then you can have multiple games running at the same time. So I think that's it is difficult though. I do appreciate that question from that coach. Very good question.
We have another one. There's a request whether you could explain one more time the repetition without repetition part again. Or could you go into greater detail about that?
Yes, I can. So repetition without repetition simply means that we're varying some aspect. We're not performing the skill in the same way every single practice repetition in a row. So as an example, we may practice a tennis serve where we hit a flat serve. Then the very next repetition, instead of hitting a flat serve, we hit a slice serve. Then we might change sides of the court, and then we might hit a kick serve. So we've repeated a tennis serve 3 times, but we haven't repeated the same serve 3 times. We've repeated 3 variations of the same serve. So, and then there's other work, and you could look this up. It's called differential learning, and they would argue that you can practice by not even if we're doing a soccer kick, you might come and kick off one step. Then you might come in with a really fast run up and kick. So you're doing exactly the same kick, but you're changing the way in which you approach the ball. You then might do a somersault on the ground, stand up, and then kick the ball. So differential learning suggests you can go off on some quite extreme movement patterns. So there's a couple of ways to get repetition without repetition.
That's great. What are some ways that spark your creative thinking? For example, what are some indicators of being a curious coach and finding these different ways to do the same thing over and over with variety?
Yeah, good point. One of the greatest things about where I used to work, which was the Australian Institute of Sport, was on our campus we would have had 24 different sports. And I was lucky enough to work with many different ones. But what I soon realised is one of the most valuable things was coaches of those sports having a coffee together and talking about how they did different activities. And what you would find is an idea from netball or soccer could equally apply to the hockey team or the volleyball team or whatever it might be. So I think if you're a curious coach, talk to coaches both within your sport, but talk to lots of different coaches, and you'll be surprised. And equally in the acrobatic sports, I think we find that with gymnastics, diving, skiing, etc. They can all learn from one another.
Thanks. I think I really like the idea of having coffee with other coaches and sharing ideas and learning more about the different sports, especially the different movements and everything. We have one more final question, if it's okay. If an athlete is not feeling up to it and is unable to perform quality repetitions, is it better for them to skip the session so that the athlete doesn't practice wrong habits, or do we just let them continue with it?
Yes, good question. Very good questions from the floor, by the way. I'll say that before I forget. Excellent. So if we think about the concept of volume, if we visualize how many repetitions it took for the athlete to get to their particular skill level, they've done literally thousands, hundreds of thousands of repetitions. So one practice session where they don't practice optimally is not going to undo and create bad habits, because it's only one little session. Now, equally, if the athlete isn't motivated, can you find a way to hook and trigger their attention? And it might be just through playing a game or doing something different on that particular occasion. So I would try and get them to still engage, but have a lower expectation of what I'm looking for. But I don't think you create bad habits in one training session.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Farrow. That was a really great sessions. Those were really great questions, and thank you for those really insightful answers. We come to the end of the Q&A, and we're going to thank you so much, and thank you everyone for sending those questions in.